Hi, everyone, and welcome to this Living an Awakened Life episode of the Awareness Podcast. My name is Susan Telford, and I'm here today with my guest, Isaira. Welcome, Isaira. It's lovely to have you with us again.
Thank you so much, Susan. Wonderful to be here with you, with everyone.
So, for those of you who don't know Isaira, she is an awakened spiritual teacher who's been initiated in a number of advanced spiritual practices and rites across a number of traditions, including Australian Aboriginal, yogic, Indian, African shamanism, and Tibetan Buddhism. When she was a young adult, Tibetan lamas recognized her as an important incarnation and travelled to Adelaide, Australia to bring her to the Himalayas to be ordained by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Isaira is also honoured as an Australian Indigenous elder and wisdom keeper. So it's lovely to be with you again, Isaira. I so enjoyed the last series of masterclasses that you did for the Teachers of God Foundation. And I'm so delighted to be able to speak to you again today. As you heard me say in the introduction, this is the Living an Awakened Life segment of the Awareness Podcast. And the first question that I want to ask you, because it's the first statement in your bio, is it says Isaira is an awakened spiritual teacher. So, what does it mean to be awakened?
Well, I guess that's how others refer to me. And my passion and whole purpose is about bringing awareness to that essence in all of us, that there's this quality of our being that is always here, that has consciousness. And so being awakened means that we are deeply aligned with that. We're really in touch with that quality of our being. And if you like, just pure consciousness. When we integrate our alignment with that to the point that we no longer depart from that awareness, that's what it means to be awakened. And so along the way, we have awakenings. We wake up out of our conditions, we wake up out of certain circumstances, beliefs, dogmas, attachments, aversions, etc. But it's only when we really come deeply into alignment again with our essential self, which is pure awareness, that we truly begin to awaken.
So that quality of awakeness is something that we all have.
Right. Absolutely. And it's a case of the habits and the environment that we live within that determines whether we're in touch with it or we lose touch with it. So even as infants, there's a stronger quality of this awakefulness in us naturally as humans. We come in as this vast oceanic awareness. We don't experience an immediate separation and division from mother, from the surrounds of life, from the field of light, etc. And so we lose that awakefulness of presence the moment conditions are imposed on us.
Yeah.
And so the more deeply we're conditioned into distractions and fixations, the less capable we are of being really in touch with that awake quality.
Yeah, I love the poem by, I don't know if you're aware of the poem by William Wordsworth, who was a famous English poet who says that we come trailing clouds of glory from whence we came. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, I do love Wordsworth and probably one of the very few that I'm familiar with, but how beautiful those words and such truth in that, that we all come from that. We're all of it. We are it. We're born of it. And well, we all have the ability to come back into connection with that too.
Yeah. I think, I know certainly for me, and I know for others, being on a spiritual path has at times felt very out of the mainstream.
Mm,
Um,
mm.
and to have this realization that this actually is the true nature of everyone, that we're not on some kind of woo-woo strange path, but coming back to that which we truly are, has been really, really comforting, I suppose, to me. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess if we look historically at our human journey and evolution, we see that we go through these cycles. And so if we look way back, we see that we all were Indigenous. If we look right back into our ancestry, we were all living in alignment with the natural laws. And consequently, we were deeply connected in ourselves, with each other, with existence as a whole fabric. We then went through a cycle, a passage where we were dispossessed. And of course, we're still in that passage where Indigenous nations and cultures have been taken over by this, ruling hierarchy. And consequently, most humans on the planet are living in a dispossessed state, which also gave rise to enormous suffering. And from that, religion was born as this hope, a source, an avenue of hope to make sense of our suffering, to make sense of the mystery and the confusion of our life. And unfortunately, that religious body and bodies and passage that we have, I guess, worked with over, 2,000 to 3,000 years, in its nature has also been hierarchical, which means it still has an element of division. And so then we get exclusivity and all of those, the dogmas and the stigmas that go along with it. And so there's still all this division. And we've seen that echoed throughout the whole spiritual journey still, even though we're moving away from religious hierarchy and our intention is to come back to our essential self, there's still elements of division and judgment and lack of understanding, as if, like you said, as if, well, somehow we're weird and woo-woo to speak of things more spiritually, when the truth is that's what we all are.
Yeah, and I think that, we seem to have this tendency to look outside of ourselves for happiness or for direction, or when you were speaking there about religions, that's a manifestation of that, isn't it? This looking outside ourselves rather than turning within.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about the traditions, that you have been initiated into. They're very diverse traditions, and I'm interested in the commonalities. That because I think all paths have at their kernel the truth. So I'm interested in what you have received from each of these, and just what you would like to say about those. So just to recap for our listeners, so Australian Aboriginal, Yogic Indian, African Shamanism, and Tibetan Buddhism.
Mm.
And I want to share with you, Saira, I was a Tibetan Buddhist for 20 years.
Oh, how beautiful. So there's an affinity there, and you would have had an incredibly deep experience yourself and discovered all the great blessings and benefits of that particular tradition. So in respect to particularly your focal point on this question was, what are the similarities or the commonalities that I have discovered having ventured into those different traditions and had an incredible array of experiences. And it reminds me that if we look at the tenet of even every religion, we'll see it all comes down to loving kindness based on the truth and the principle that we are one life. And so in my ancestral culture, which is Indigenous Australian, our central tenet, and it goes through every single clan or tribe Australia-wide, the central tenet is we are one, and everything is interconnected and interdependent. That means what I do to you, I do to myself. It means there really is no absolute, fundamental, separate me and you, that we are all entwined. And so that commonality is really there if we dig down into the heart of all of the traditions. So in Aboriginal Australian, if we realise that we are truly one, then we have empathy and we live a life of sacred respect and kindness to all beings and all creation. If we look at yogic Indian, it's about understanding union. Yoga literally means union, or to unify. And so it's on the principle of understanding that if we live in that premise, then we live in harmony and we live with greater awakening or awareness. And then if we look at African shamanism, again, we look into all the different tribal cultures and practices, and we see that same tenet is held very, very strongly. It's about the sharing of the collective, that we're not isolated, that we need to understand the relevance and the power of kin ties. And not only that, but also, and again, very similar to Aboriginal law and wisdom, is that first and foremost, we all come from Earth. We emerge from this creation. And so then if we look into Buddhism, Buddhism strips it back down to the essential of what is the nature of our being. And again, we come back to that it is all this consciousness. We are all one. And that if we know and we understand this, we cultivate compassion. We generate the empathy to have loving kindness towards all beings, to not cause harm, to not perpetuate suffering. And so, whilst all these traditions have their unique expressions and practices and rituals, we really do come right back to that same truth underlying every spiritual quest in the world. It's resting on that ultimate truth. I mean, even if we look at absolute religions like Christianity, we'll see, well, God is the creator of all things. What does that mean? If we are a part of God, then we're not separate from God, and God is the creator of all things. It is one being. So,
yeah. Jesus said, "The Father and I are one."
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. And Jesus also said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." And eternally. If we really look into that, where that's become skewed is in the fixation on the identity I am, rather than I am consciousness.
Yeah.
And so that's a deeper, more mystical aspect of commonality between all these traditions, is that when we strip back the individual expression, we come into essence, we come into spirit, we come into energy, we come into consciousness, and in that there absolutely is no separation.
Yeah. As you say, it's been it's been kind of taken to mean when Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, that it meant him as an individual. And yet
Yeah.
he also said, before Abraham was, I am, which makes
Yeah.
no sense from an individual life that Jesus had for 33 years.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. I'm so glad you raised that point, because that adds weight to this shift of how we can take those words. How can we contemplate those words in a way that expands us rather than, traps us in a singular reference? And certainly not what Jesus, that great Christ consciousness, ever intended.
Yeah. Yes. Um, so when we begin on a spiritual path, we're often looking for more happiness or inner peace or something for ourselves. So that's so in contrast with how the path develops. And I think perhaps is that true for all of us? That's how we begin the path, um, looking
Most,
for something.
yeah, most often, because it's suffering that catalyzes our desire to realize a deeper truth and to liberate ourselves. And suffering is a very personal experience. The truth is, as much as we can feel for others, we are truly wholly alone in ourself and our experience. We cannot have the experience of another. We can only have the experience of ourself. And so that's actually why initially the quest for awakening is somewhat self-centered. It is somewhat driven or sponsored by the desire to gain something better for ourselves. But like you say, along the way, naturally, as a result of realigning ourselves, that shifts. Whether we intend it to or not, the more deeply we come back into alignment with truth, the more expansive we become. And gradually we start to realize that truth really lies beyond our siloed approach that is orientated on ourselves.
Yeah. And we hear phrases such as what you're seeking is seeking you, or you already are what you seek. To what extent is there not just seeking from this side, but a pull back, an attraction back to what we are? What's your
Yeah.
perspective on that?
I guess this is where I can say I really value my roots ancestrally in my Indigenous culture. Why I value that so deeply is because just very naturally, by way of the laws of knowledge, intelligence, the way of living, cultivates that state in which we are, yes, we're centered, we're anchored, we're open, we're aware and receptive, but it's not a projecting forward of our individual identity. It's a sitting back in with such openness and such awareness that existence is happening. We are the expression of existence. And if we can draw on those principles and incorporate them into our spiritual journey, no matter where we're from, because we're all human, we're all part of, life, the natural laws. If we can draw on those principles, we can much more readily be in that quality of openness, like you say, rather than projecting and trying and efforting and it's me, the individual. We really become open, and the awakening is happening through everything, not me as a separate individual.
Yes, yes. So before I want to ask you about those principles, but before I do that, we've said that awakening, the awakened quality is inherent, that it's not something that's far away from us or in the future or whatever. And so I like to invite teachers to offer our listeners an experience of contacting that right here in the moment as they listen. Because people may be thinking, well, okay, I'm hearing that this awakened quality is my true nature, is here, but I don't feel it. I've not experienced it. Um, I'd like to
I
invite.
would love to share that with you, and for us to take some moments to go into settle into something a little more immersive. I think that's a beautiful invitation, Susan. Thank you. And I guess just before we do, I want to acknowledge that I guess for many of us, we've encountered so much mystifying and romanticizing around this whole concept of awakening. And it's generated and cultivated some unrealistic notions and expectations about the awakened essence within us, or having the experience that is more awakened. And I hear it again and again and again in so many participants in my programs or retreats, that they're waiting for some spectacular feeling or experience. And the truth is, it's actually incredibly ordinary in its deepest essence. It's as natural as you just sitting here on your chair right now and really acknowledging, bring your full attention to you sitting here on your chair right now, or you listeners and those of you who are joining in with this experience. Bring your 100% attention to this moment. Let's just do that, just for a few moments, nothing complicated. 100% attention. Now, notice as you do that, there's a shift in your sensory field, as if your senses become a little bit more heightened. Most of you would notice that there's almost like vibrationally a little bit of a tingling or a warmth or a sense of, something's come up, or something's come in, or something's opened. So now, with this 100% attention, I invite you to pay really deep attention to the seeing. Really sit inside, be the seeing. Now, if you're really seeing and really listening and really sensing, what happens? Just notice the quality of this state of really engaged attention. Notice for yourself. So what do you notice, Susan?
I certainly noticed that sense of tingling and alertness that you spoke of. And I've often spoken of that before as feeling like a cat at a mouse hole. Absolute attention, absolute presence, and alertness.
Exactly.
The absence of any kind of problem.
Bingo. So there's no projection of the narrative, right? It's not a narrative that's happening in that moment. It's not definition, interpretation. Yes, there's awareness, like that. There's this subtle streaming of the mental kind of referencing or filtering of being fully alert in the now, like, there's a mental reference of, oh, tingling, fresh, oh, expansive, light, oh, shadow, colour, sounds, whatever. But it's no longer caught up in this sense of a separate self that's having a story about it. Mm-hmm. There's not a me outside of that experience. It's just, I am this. I'm here experiencing this. That is a wakefulness. And hence why I prefaced it with that encouragement for everyone to really relax the notion that it's meant to be something incredibly mystical and spectacular. Because if we rest into that, which seems maybe quite ordinary, then we actually start to really open and discover that the magic is in the ordinariness of every moment if we really are present and are wakefully here. We get to experience through a deeper dimension of our being.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Because I think there are two aspects, aren't there? We've all read the stories of the huge mystical openings that render people unable to function, or
Right.
that people take a long, long time to integrate, and often there can be both a longing for that and also a fear of it. Well, I don't want to go too far in this awakening journey because I don't want to be dysfunctional. And so just have that experience of the ordinary. It's almost like heightened ordinariness.
Yeah, precisely. And following on from the point you made, that oftentimes people are craving but fearing at the same time the awakening experience, because it's been turned into this giant spectacle of something so mystical, and it's very real. But at the deepest level, we do know that we actually came here to really be this experience, not to get away from it. We came here to fulfill this experience, to 100% be this creation, this opportunity, this once in an infinite expanse of lifetime version of creation expressing and experiencing itself right here, right now. So at the deepest level, we know that. Now, if we turn the notion of awakening into something that splits us off from the lived experience, we are driven by fear. And that fear keeps us trapped in less conscious directions of how we can embrace the awakening experience. At the most human level, why we want to awaken? Okay, first of all, yes, sure, there's the sponsoring, self-centered quest to free ourselves from suffering, to be happier, or maybe even to be able to manifest what we want. Some people take that direction with it. But beyond that, it's really because we want to be truly ourselves. We want to truly belong. We want peace and harmony with each other. We want loving kindness. And we want that experience to translate into true meaning in our human experience. We want a better relationship with our family, our loved ones. We want a better relationship with ourselves. We want to contribute to life in a meaningful way, in a way that is authentic and true. And so if we set ourselves up for this whole journey to the the apex of Mount Everest, what are we doing? We're departing all of that we've come here to really embody and experience. And it no longer translates into reality. We do think, oh no, I'm going to be judged and I'm going to be woo-woo and I'm going to be separate. And oh, do I have to give up my job? And oh, how am I going to survive? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas if we take it back into the heart of the ordinariness and just the natural beingness of ourself, and we recognize the value of that right here, right now, that a wakefulness is in you, it's in me, it's in every one of us. And when we just welcome that and we align with that, very simply, life has changed. Life is transformed in this moment, right here, right now, because as you said, all that narrative drops. The mind becomes very quiet. We engage with what really is right here. And it's from this we have the ability to respond with love. And from that, true meaning is grown.
That's a wonderful description of how to live an awakened life. Yes, thank you. The next thing I wanted to ask you about is the 4 sacred pillars of life that are expressed in Indigenous wisdom. Can you tell us a bit about that? We're going to speak a bit later about the masterclasses that you're going to be giving on this topic, but can you give us an overview of what the 4 sacred pillars are and how they inform the living of an awakened life?
So I mentioned just briefly before you asked me about the different traditions and the commonalities, and how in my ancestral roots, the way we have lived for tens of thousands of years revolves around this. It's actually based on these 4 sacred pillars. And that means that it's not a siloed experience. It means that we acknowledge with deep reverence and awareness the fabric of life and how we exist within it and what our relationship is within it. And when we honor that and we live in accord with that, we do experience naturally. We don't have to try and get back to oneness because we live it. We experience it directly. We don't have to try to create connection and a sustainable world of loving respect because we're it. We are living it, creating it every day. And so the 4 sacred pillars give us a very succinct map, a model that we can look at and understand, okay, these are the 4 primary quadrants, if you like, of our life, what it means as a human experience and being part of this creation. And all of that ties into the one central tenet, which is everything is one, everything is interconnected. So what is one? What are all these everything is interconnected? First pillar is our connection with Earth. As I mentioned before, we didn't land here. We emerged from this. The truth is our being is born of creation, born of earth, of nature, of every living thing. So that's pillar 1, our relationship with nature, with earth, with country. Number 2 is kinship, the relationship with all the living beings, all the living creatures, not just our family unit. So kinship, understanding there is a role of interdependence between every living thing. And we don't even call rocks inanimate. We know they are also living beings. And then the third tenet, the pillar, is to do with the unique expression of each of us, but ultimately when we are in connection with that, our soul, our spirit, we are no longer separate from anything. You know, at soul level, we are energy, we are consciousness, and therefore we're that whole one God intelligence. And we're able to be guided by that vastness, which is not just expressed through me. We're able to listen to the soul of every being, every person, every part of creation. And so we're guided by that. Again, we're not siloed in that, oh, I'm self, I'm soul, I'm spirit, right? It's very interconnected. And then the fourth pillar is the cosmic laws, understanding that there are natural laws through all of creation. And when we acknowledge those and we live in accord with those laws, we have a much bigger, deeper comprehension of ourself and existence. And from that, we can't do anything but live in a sacred way. And as I said, all of that combined then means we're living a very awakened experience. We have reverence for all things. We are responsible and caring for all things. And therefore we live in harmony and in unity. We directly experience oneness, and that makes sustainable living. That is how my ancestors, our ancestors in this country lived sustainably for more than 60,000 years. Mm. So those four pillars are not exclusive to any one race or culture. Those four pillars are relevant to every single human because we are all part of these elements of life.
There's two things I want to pick up on from that. The first is in the Indian tradition and in some other traditions, it's said phrases like the world does not exist, the world is an illusion, and that can be misinterpreted such that this feeling of coming from the earth and being of the earth and being responsible for the earth is almost pushed to one side under this guise of, well, it doesn't matter because it's an illusion anyway. So would you speak to that, please?
I'm so glad you raised this point. Language has become so I guess complex and in a way dangerous that we can take little snippets out of these ancient traditions and lose all of the nuances and therefore lose the context and set out on a completely erroneous path. So, for example, in Patanjali's sutras, one of the translations is, enlightenment is the cessation of the mind or thinking. When the nuance translation is, enlightenment is the cessation of identification with the mind or thinking. Think about how many people have taken that path into, I am not my mind, I'm not my body, I'm not blah, 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 blah. That is dismissive. Now, one way for us to look at this in a simplified manner is to acknowledge that as a result of this fracturing of the way we live, we're fractured away from the four pillars I just referenced. As a result of that fracturing and dispossession, disconnection, we have deep-rooted fear, which produces attachment and aversion. Okay, Buddhism looks into that, right? And that creates all our suffering. But if we look at how that is manifesting as a human experience now, we have spiritual and human ego. It's narcissism. We are self-centered. It's the sponsoring goal is about me. I want to be enlightened to overcome my suffering, or you look at the world, everywhere we look, it's self-centered. The opposite to that is abandonment, escapism, spiritual escapism. So what you're just referring to is a form of spiritual escapism. By taking up that notion, which is a very high level of metaphysical insight, without the nuance, we lose the context and we become dismissive and we want to escape. Neither of those avenues produce true awakening or fulfillment. We're not capable of integrating and embodying the awakened essence that's within us through either one of those. And some people swing wildly between the two, ricocheting from one to the other. If we look at the nuance, I'll just give a little summary around that, how we can bring it back into context. It's the way we perceive the world that is not real. Even Einstein, I think it was Einstein or one of the greats, reminded us that even the things we call reality are just the hallucinations we agree about. That's my own, own wording for it, but essentially that's that. So the way we perceive the world is not real. That doesn't mean existence is unreal or does not exist. It's just that it doesn't quite exist the way we imagine it to. So if we accept that and that we are flawed, we have our limitations around the way we perceive, then we can open ourselves beyond our own mind's projections. And once we do that, then we begin to rest into alignment with, potentially, with natural laws. And for example, in our tradition, we speak about, I don't know if you've heard this, the dreaming and the dream time. And that's actually referring to the profound metaphysical understanding that no object is fundamentally solid or real in the way it appears to be. Everything is vibrational, everything is energy, everything is imagery and light. And so there's a complete awareness and relationship between what appears as form and formlessness, what is purely energy, what manifests as a lived experience. So we do have the ability to accommodate what appear to be opposites. That's the duality or the paradox of so-called awakening. But we need to be able to accommodate all of that. Otherwise, we do split off into our fear basis, which is then either spiritual narcissism or spiritual escapism.
Yes, thank you for that. So, as I mentioned earlier, you're going to be giving 2 master classes in May, 1st of May and the 15th of May, with the title, We Are One, Not Number One. What this wisdom brings to awakening. I love that title. That succinctly says everything, doesn't it? And in the notes that you sent to me, I just want to read a little bit of it because I think this will resonate with some of our listeners. Mm-hmm. You said, we must awaken to more than the self, the capital S self. While the predominant Western model of awakening focuses on individual consciousness, the self, Asira's approach to awakening is a holistic one, which has us awaken to the sacred in everything. Instead of a siloed, conceptual and abstract approach, it is an awakening that is integrated, embodied and grounded, rather than siloed, conceptual and abstract. This is why even among those on a committed spiritual path, there is still a deep sense of something missing. The human spirit is hungering to be nurtured. We're living in a world that is fractured and conflicted more than ever, and people are reporting a sense of fear, isolation, depression, anxiety, and chronic illness in epidemic numbers. The part that says, this is why even those on a committed path still have a deep sense of something missing. This is something that I hear over and over again. I've been on a path for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, and yet there is something missing. And I think what you said there about the ricocheting from spiritual narcissism to spiritual bypassing is that's the something missing, isn't it? The central part is almost jumped over.
Yeah. And that fundamentally is about integration. It's about us coming into a more holistic approach and really embracing all that we are. And that can't be siloed. We're not separate from each other, from creation, from the life around us. And it's all here. It's all available to us. So it's not like this is outlandish and something beyond reach. It is us. And that opportunity is awaiting every single one of us.
So in your masterclasses, the first one on the 1st of May, they're at 7 p.m. Eastern. There'll be details in the show notes that accompany this podcast so that you can sign up to join us. Your first session is called We Are One, Not One, Number One. And it says anchored, I'm not going to be able to say this word, anchored in the recognition of, what's the word, NGAL?
Ngali Gumara. Ngali Gumara.
Ngali Gumara. And what is that?
So that's in my ancestral language, Ngali Gumara. Just like Sanskrit, because it's an ancient root language. Sanskrit and Aboriginal language are of the same root. And these are languages that are voiced expressions of existence as it is, pre-ego. So Ngali Gumara refers to the true nature of ourself, which is everything is one and interconnected. In one of its translations, it means there is only one and there is not one. In other words, they're one and the same, like the ocean and its many drops. You can't separate them out. They're the same being, one and not one. And then in a contextual translation, what does that really mean in context of our human experience? Well, yes, we are one, but we are not number one. And this points back into what I was saying before, that unfortunately a lot of our spiritual questing is bouncing around this spiritual narcissism to spiritual escapism. And as a result, it's still driven by this little part in there that is, but I'm number one. And of course, at, different degrees of whether it's really destructive or just incredibly unconscious as a default setting in people. But if we look at the world, that's it in a nutshell. That is the challenge for us to now face and transform. If we can transform that, if we can disrupt this whole spiritual kind of setup we've created and go, hang on a minute, maybe we're kind of orientating ourselves a little off track here. Let's realign. Let's come back to the oneness in holism rather than siloed me self. Maybe we can really transform the challenges we're facing in the world, because all the challenges rest on that superiority of me being number one.
Yeah. So in the second class, which is on the 15th of May, the title of that one is Using Indigenous Wisdom in Your Spiritual Practices and Everyday Living. So what might people get from that class?
Well, we will get to really explore in more depth the four pillars and how and why that really is relevant to every single human on the planet, and how that has relevance for you in your own spiritual journey, and how we can use that as a map that really does steer us. It can seem incredibly simple. It can be very simple, but it can also go into greater and greater depths of wisdom and guide us step by step along our journey to really experience greater reconnection, not just within ourself or driven by that, the self, but as a whole, as a collective with life. That is where we really get profound awakening, and not just profound awakening, but real integration, so that we can embody the awakened essence of ourselves.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very much looking forward to it. So to those listening, if you have had that sense of something missing, then I really encourage you to check out the show notes and to see what's being offered here by Isaira in May. And before we finish, Isaira, I wanted to ask you, I know last year you had a fire at your centre, and I wanted to ask you about the progress that has been made on that, and whether I would like to, perhaps if you still have your GoFundMe page, I'd like to share that in the show notes for the podcast, so that if anyone feels to make a donation, they would be able to do that.
Oh, thank you so much, Susan. That's incredibly caring and generous, and an expression of your awareness and connection as well. Thank you. I really appreciate that. It's been a really big journey. I think everyone can appreciate, whether we've been through it or not. We can imagine or understand how intense it is to go through an experience of such consuming destruction. There was so much that was destroyed in that fire. From our cultural perspective, it's also seen as a purification and a clearing away, ready for a new passage of creation. So I'm very blessed that I can welcome that side of the experience as well. At the, I guess at the ground level, well, we're finally at a point where things are lined up with insurance for the rebuild. We're still, of course, insurance doesn't cover everything. There are just so many things that could not be replaced from that. And so we're incredibly grateful for the people that have contributed so far. We've been able to reestablish a workspace and to continue rebuilding some of the behind the scenes infrastructure and utilities that we need for me to be able to continue service as well. And that's a long-term process. So big thank you for bringing that up, and, opening the space if people feel to support what we're dedicated to, and our ability to keep going forward with it. Thank you.
Thank you. So, is there anything else that you would like to say before we end our time together?
I'm just so grateful, Susan, to you for this platform, for everyone listening, because this isn't just lip service. When we're sitting here acknowledging that awakening is not something that happens in isolation. It really cannot be a siloed approach or experience, because we truly are connected. We are a part of each other. And so in that, I deeply acknowledge you and all of our listeners and anyone who will join in the programs. acknowledging we really are in it together. And with that, we have enormous hope, because there is great power that is within each of us. This love, this awareness, this is where we change everything, right here together.
Thank you so much, Zaira. Thank you very much for being with me today.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. Bye-bye.